My name is Steve Rennick. I'm a long-term friend of Jim Harries, James Osmar Harries. The good doctor and I served together for 7 years in rural East Africa at a school together, and those were wonderful years. All of these years later, it is my privilege to get to do a bit of an interview, kind of a webinar podcast with Jim, and help to introduce his latest new book. So Jim, here we go. Across the miles, over the ocean, here we go. Question number 1. So tell us, Jim, what is the core of your argument?
The core of the argument that I'm making in this book, I think, is the critique that interracial, interethnic issues are almost universally these days being considered in contexts in which whites are dominant. Now, I mean, the USA would be one example, UK, Australia would be other examples. Now, South Africa, of course, would be a counterexample, as would be the rest of the African continent. Now, when relations with other ethnicities, in this case, racism done against blacks, for example, are considered in white dominant contexts, and those considerations that are made in white dominant contexts are made by people who on a global scale are very powerful, then their agenda as to how to relate to people of African origin tends to have a global impact, even though its actual roots are in a particular context. And by comparison with the number of people of African origin who live under, let's say, African rule, those people of African origin, or including people like the Aborigines in Australia who live under white rule, are relatively few. Now, in fact, what this approach to anti-racism does, it actually seeks to perpetuate, seeks to extend white rule, because the way that non-white ethnicities are being responded to, now my focus, as I say, is on people of African origin, and that is advocated by the global community, is that in which whites are dominant.
Question number 2. How, though, does anti-racism, in your view, undermine Africa?
How does anti-racism undermine Africa? Well, in many ways, of course, I've already explained how that happens in what I've mentioned just now. Where whites are dominant, whites take themselves as being the norm. And they take secularism, which is their kind of preferred ideology these days for running their countries, as being the norm, as being normal. Now, what then happens in those normal contexts? You have people come who are not normal. African people, black people, people of African origin. Then, of course, what the dominant white community tries to do is to try to bring them into, incorporate them into their notion of normality. Now, that notion of white normality, again, extends beyond the white dominant countries, particularly into Africa, that remains these days enormously dependent on white economies and on white media and so forth. So news services, for example, in Africa tend to borrow inputs from outside the continent. News services like the BBC and Deutsche Welle and Voice of Africa, Voice of America, clearly very dominant, and the picture they portray is always one of trying to make out the black African people are the same, essentially culturally, as Western people. Now that, of course, is disenfranchising, because the process by which white Western people got to be the way they are has to be obscured in order to give the impression that black or African people already are the same as white people.
Number 3, tell us about language.
Language and the consideration of language is an important part of this book. I think it's incredible from where I am now, looking at the way that the dominant Western people today in the globe look at the language issue. Now, one way of looking at this language issue in relation to globalization. So I'm here in Kenya, let's say, and I have a little mouse, my pet mouse. You are in South Africa at a zoo looking at an elephant. And I say, hey, it's so big. Now, my saying that a mouse is so big means it's probably 5 inches long. You're looking at an elephant and hearing me say, it's so big. And so you're picturing something that's, 5 meters tall. Language is contextual. Language isn't something that has a universe of its own. Words don't carry meanings. Words impact on people. And words impact on people according to where they are, according to their own context, according to their own ways of life. So the same words, the same sentences, the same phrases, the same kind of ways of presenting things that mean one thing in a Western country amongst the Western people will mean another thing amongst an African people or people of African origin and in an African country. Now, if we take Africa, there are said to be 2,000 languages in Africa. Now, it depends what you consider to be language, what's a dialect and so forth. But there are many, many languages. So every African person born on the continent of Africa, with perhaps very few exceptions, has their own language. And that language connects with their way of life. Their way of life, or their ways of life, are largely unknown to many Western people. So they connect to what we could say is a mystery, a way of life that people in the West don't comprehend. Now, when those people use English, two things happen. One, they spend 10, 12, 15, 20 years learning English. They learn it all in formal contexts. In many cases, or in most cases, you don't get English from playing with your friends and from your mum or in the kitchen or with, out on their farm. You get English from school, and maybe nowadays also from watching TV. So people learn to speak English in a certain way, which is not the way they live. At the same time also, as soon as they do try to apply English to the way they live, the foundation from which they're speaking English is obviously their own languages, which are expressed in ways of life that are largely mysteries to Westerners. So this and other factors means that when we receive English language discourse from African people, we should be very wary about assuming that we understand what they're saying. As I said, this is only a small part of a very large issue. I haven't even mentioned there the fact that people who are dependent on your financial largesse for their very lives tend to say things that please you, and so on and so forth. What I'm implying here is that in order to understand what's happening in Africa, we need to have Western people in Africa who are not part of the system in the beginning, who look at things as Westerners do, but then learn African languages, learn African ways of life, and thus learn to interpret Africa in a way that actually makes sense of the reality of Africa back in the West. That is hardly happening at all. Instead, the West prefers to take its vision of Africa from indigenous African people. And then within America, it takes its vision of Africa from people who lived in Africa maybe 300 years ago, many generations ago. They are, it seems to me clearly, the dominant representation of what Africa is. The people see in many Western nations those people who've lived in those nations for generations and generations. Now that is a gross, all those things are a gross misrepresentation of Africa that is unhelpful for those of us on the African continent.
Question number 4. You mean that there are positives to a belief in witchcraft?
Yeah, many people think that witchcraft is something that's only negative. In fact, I think the dominant view of it tends to be that it's like a kind of vestigial organ. It's something that's there that people just put aside when they become enlightened. It makes it appear that those African people reputed to believe in witchcraft are somehow daft. Why do they believe in witchcraft? This doesn't make any sense to us at all. Now that, of course, aggravates issues of anti-racism, because I only suspect that even those people of African origin who have lived in the West for a number of generations might not have shed entirely this witchcraft belief. But what I want to say is witchcraft isn't just a negative thing, and neither is it a vestigial thing. It's something that's inherent to being human. Now I say that on the basis that I consider witchcraft to be profoundly powered by envy. And I don't think there's anybody who can say that they don't have any envy. The difference between Western societies and many African societies is in the way that envy is expressed and in the way that envy is dealt with. Now in Africa, that envy in many respects is dealt with through what we say the paradigm of witchcraft. Now you need to remember, of course, that when we talk about witchcraft, that's an English term, but it's also used to describe a lot of African realities that remain unfamiliar to English speakers. So bear in mind that I'm using the term in a particular way, in an, let's say, a way unknown to the dominant Western world. So let's just give an example of how witchcraft can be a positive and why it needs to be transformed and not just got rid of. People tend to get into conflict with one another. Sometimes we get very angry at other people because of things that either they've done to us or that we think they've done to us. That anger can result in gossip, can result in arguments, can result in fighting, can even result in killing. Now imagine a solution to this problem. So a particular man or particular woman is very angry with somebody. They want to go and kill them, Well, they can go to one of the older men, if you like, or even a younger man, and say, look, I want to kill that person. I'm really angry with them. Now, if they give them a machete and say, go on and do it, then blood will be shed, the person will probably die. But if, on the other hand, they say, rather than go and attack them with a machete, let me deal with it. You bring me a goat, and I'll make sure that person dies. Now, you could call it hocus pocus, you could call it what you like. But if that witch doctor can convince the angry person that they're the one who's going to deal with the victim they're looking at, then they can do so by means that doesn't involve violence. Now, the person who is angry then looks carefully to see whether what the witch doctor has done has worked. Now, let's say, for example, that the wife of the person who they're angry at becomes very sick. They think, got him. You know, even if the means used by the witch doctor haven't been precise, that can be sufficient to satisfy the anger of the person concerned, and of course to save the life of the person they're angry with, who otherwise might have got bludgeoned to death.
Question number 5. Can't witchcraft be got rid of?
Now, as I've indicated, I'm looking at racial issues from an African perspective rather than a Western perspective, rather than a majority white perspective. Although I can only suspect, on the basis of the understanding I picked up here, that those people of African origin in the West retain some of what people have here. Now, of course, those in the West don't know whether that's the case or not, because they don't know what people here are like anyway. Let's say witchcraft is part of an understanding of life. Now, it was very striking to me when I realized that the term for witchcraft in different African languages is the same term that could also be used for God. In other words, it's a means of resolving interhuman problems. Is witchcraft. It's that some people term it magic. I don't like the term magic very much because it implies supernatural, which is not what is in people's minds here in Africa at all. Means of dealing with problems that are kind of a little bit mysterious. In other words, as Christians, we could say that unfortunately some African people have a wrong understanding of God. Underlying Western civilization has been centuries and centuries of people correcting such wrong understanding of God. That's in our Christian history. And it's that misguided or wrong understanding of God that still besets African communities and causes many problems in African communities. But it's only a wrong understanding of God if you take Christianity as presenting the right understanding of God. And also, of course, we have to remember it's not necessarily a wrong understanding of God to the African people themselves who live in it. I don't see the Bible as being a westernizing book, and neither do I see it as being a magical book that suddenly transforms someone's whole life from what they've always been into something that other people are. In other words, we shouldn't expect the impact of the gospel to be like turning on a light or turning off a light, but the gospel works in people's hearts, and it can work in the hearts of African people. And if we see the necessity for that and appreciate the role of the gospel in human life, then we can be a part of encouraging that, not only amongst African people, but other people around the world. If, on the other hand, we consider witchcraft to be some kind of vestigial thing that needs to be got rid of, that implies that it's the rationality that's going to get rid of witchcraft, which demonstrably isn't true, because you need to get rid of witchcraft before you can really engage in rationality. So you see, this way of looking at witchcraft is a defense of secularism against the notion that perhaps Christianity is important in the history of humankind. And the way that that approach is upheld is by denying that African people are different in the name of not being racist.
Question number 6. So what does anti-racism do?
Yeah, so in what way do I say that anti-racism ring fences secularism? Secularism as a faith believes that what secularism calls religions are an unnecessary kind of appendage to life, as I've just described witchcraft. So according to secular philosophy and ideology, religion is something that is going to quietly disappear, and what will remain is secularism and rationality. Now that historically is built largely on the philosophy of logical positivism, which unfortunately for secularists went into decline in the 1970s, really has been discredited. So they have a faith in something, the foundations of which have been removed. Now, anti-racism is a means of trying to conceal that delicate faith so that people can continue to believe in secularism despite the lack of evidence. But you see, people's ways of life, which secularists call people's religions, do affect them and how they are and how they react to things and how they work and how they talk and how they relate. That's a problem to our secular liberal age. How do they deal with it? By saying that if you refer to, if you allude to, if you respond to people's ways of life, people's inherent ways of life, that are any ways of life that are not secular, otherwise probably known as religions, then you're likely to be accused of being racist. So if people's way of life can reduce, let's say, their secular acumen, if you suspect or accuse or work on the basis that someone's way of life can interfere with their secular acumen, then you are racist. You have to ignore the impact that someone's foundational way of life has on them in order to be not racist.
Question number 7. What is a multipolar world?
Yeah. Now, I mean, this is let me just say, this book contains 10 essays. I stopped at 10 because it seemed like a round number. I could have written 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. The issues I raise here are massive. And in some respects, I have written more chapters, and some of them have been published as articles. So one issue that I included in the book was this notion of perhaps we ought to live in a multipolar world. Today's anti-racism is globalized anti-racism is Western based. So if you're in India, if you're maybe, I don't know China, I've never been to China, but certainly if you're in Africa, to be non-racist is to treat people as if they're Westerners. Now this is such an irony in Africa. Donors coming to Africa in order to use their funds want to know that the understanding of Africans is the same as that of Westerners. If it's not, then they may not get the funds. If a visitor comes to much of Africa, they expect people to understand English. And to say that, for example, Africans can't understand English because they're not secular is racist. Whereas, quite on the contrary, to say that a Westerner can't properly understand Swahili isn't racist, because Swahili is to do with religion and complicated mystical things that we really don't need anymore in the world today. That's the notion. So with the thought I bring in the book, well, why should the Western way of life, the secular way of life, be used as a base? Now I'll tell you why. Because it builds on Christianity, and Christianity considers itself universal. So secularism has taken on that universalist thinking for Christianity, but instead of saying there's one God, it's saying there's one people. We are the ones who should rule the world. So, okay, so let's put that aside and say, no, that's wrong. Why should one people be better than everybody else? Let's say then that racism is multipolar. So someone going to Congo should behave like a Congolese, and will be accused of racism if they do not behave like a Congolese. So if you go to Congo and you assume people to have just one wife, then you're racist, because in Congo it's common to have more than one wife. Similarly, one could say if you suggest that someone doesn't believe in witchcraft, that's racist, because in Congo it's witchcraft is kind of an hegemonic belief. It's an irony that the secular West insists that African people can do what they do, but they don't deign to even consider that they should be able to do what African people do. So if we take Western life as being rooted in secularism and African life as being rooted in witchcraft, but to say that is racist. So you have to say, or you have to assume, that African people are as secular as Western people are. They're as good at engineering, they're as good at maths, they're as good at rationality. But you don't have to say, and no one would claim, that Western people are as good as African people are at witchcraft. That's just a non-issue. But see, this is about a multipolar world. If you put God outside of the equation, then the question arises, well, why is it the Christian West that becomes a model for everybody else? And if the Christian West has no legitimacy to being the model, which really doesn't, if it denies its roots in Christian belief or in biblical belief, then it's just one of many kinds of belief. So then the justification for making anti-racism global goes.
Question number 8. How should we deal with poverty?
Goes. So poverty. I mean, I hear statistics at different times, like the average black in America has 1/7 of the income of the average white in America, and so forth. And then how does capitalist America or capitalist UK or wherever try to deal with that issue? Well, they use means, or are considering using means, or at times use means, to enrich minorities to try and bring them up to the level to do away with this accusation that the white people are the wealthiest. So they do it by handouts, at least to some extent. Now that reasoning, nations in Western countries usually don't think about whether African people living in Africa also deserve the same levels of income. It's like an African person living in the Congo is not yet human, but when he or she steps into the US or the UK, suddenly they become human and deserving of social security handouts and equal rights and everything else. But you see, then the model, nevertheless, that's applied is that Africa is going to be helped if we give them money. Is that necessarily true at all? I'm afraid I don't think it is. People's economics as a concept really isn't in Africa either, but okay, people's economic standards of living largely arise from the ways in which they live, how they do things, what they interact with, what their priorities are. Now, if particular ways of life result in a lower level of economic prosperity, and you keep throwing money at them, the money actually draws people away from sense. Let's think of it this way. This is very, very widespread in Africa. The language that people understand is their own African language. If left with their own language to their own devices, they may be able to achieve something incredible. But young people very soon realize that quick money, that you don't have to think for or work hard for, comes through English. So young people spend, as I say, 10, 15 years learning English and neglecting their own languages, neglecting their own thinking. Thus, their societies end up stuck, if you like. Now, this is a process that I'm very interested in studying, but that essentially, which gives people release from the horrors. Now, witchcraft has positives, but it's also a horrible way of life because it constantly attributes problems to victims. The way out of that comes exactly from the scriptures, from the Bible, from the good news of Christ. That's the way out of poverty.
Question number 9. What do people hold to be valuable?
Very much in contradiction to all this that we're saying. In Africa as in the West, and I think today in much of the world, perhaps China an exception, but not China really either. What began in Europe is valued all over. People are using computers, sometimes English, sometimes like in China, and those people who realize that they need to maintain their own foundation for their life, even if they borrow things from other people. Even Germany doesn't use English, they use their own language. But the technology, the thinking, the rationality from the West is all over. In other words, we could say, in that respect, white superiority is in your face everywhere. Now, the error seems clear to me that whites these days make is that they think they're the ones who are superior. It's not us, it's not them, however you want to look at me. It's God who's superior. What has enabled whites to do what they do today is their adherence to the gospel. And I mean, that started way back in whatever century. People were absolutely devoted to the Bible, believing nothing else, let's say for 1,000 years. That's a lot of generations of our ancestors who built a foundation on the Bible, which has us kind of forget what life is without the scriptures, without having a foundation in God. All that in the name of anti-racism has to be concealed in order to make out that people of African origin are just the same as white people. I mean, it's just not true. How can you cancel 1,000 years of history? The reason people want to try and cancel it is to maintain secularism. Anti-racism is the last bastion trying to support secular faith. That's why, in fact, in practice, Christians tend to be less anti-racist than non-Christians because they realize there's more going on. We need to inform them in more detail of what's actually going on. Making out through media and other communication that Africa is already secular in order to deal with racism back in the West, as I've already indicated, is a catastrophe for us here, because that means that the way that African people might be able to benefit from secularism is concealed from them, intentionally concealed.
Thanks for tuning in. I hope that you will consider buying and reading and discussing and sharing the latest book from Dr. Jim Harries. This is Steve Rennick. Good day.